Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, mesdames et messieurs, meine Damen und Herren. Welcome and thank you for joining today's Bridge Forum debate about the Economic and Monetary Union by stages on the anniversary of the Werner Report. I think it's quite fitting that this event takes place here in Luxembourg because Pierre Werner was, over the period of 25 years, for 20 years, the Prime Minister of this country. And he put a serious stamp on the European Union and the integration process. I'm Werner, the President of the European Investment Bank, and I will be joined by very eminent panelists here in Luxembourg and virtually from around Europe today. Before introducing them, though, I'd like to give the floor to Pierre Gramegna, Luxembourg Minister of the Economy and Finance, who is connected via video for introduction to today's proceedings. Pierre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Werner, for being the moderator and introducing this exciting conference that we've planned some time ago. I'd like to congratulate the Bridge Forum for organizing it. Excellencies, dear speakers, ladies and gentlemen, I would have loved to welcome you in Luxembourg live, but unfortunately a tiny little virus that nobody sees has decided differently. Nevertheless, it is good that we learn to live with this virus and do this conference via teleconference. So thank you, Werner, for presiding to the event as President of the European Investment Bank, and also welcome to the President of the ECB, Christine Lagarde, President of the Eurogroup, Paschal, Donohoe, the Executive Vice President of the Commission, Valdis Dombrovskis, and the Managing Director of the ESM, Klaus, Regling, and not to forget the Rector of the Luxembourg University is going to join us also, Stéphane Pallage. Now, it is my duty to do the introduction. I thought that would be the smartest thing to do. And at this time of coronavirus, many are saying that we're living through the deepest crisis ever. I beg your pardon, we shouldn't give such a description. Nobody really knows how long this crisis will be and how deep it will be. And I have the impression that the media take real pleasure, and some politicians, in always describing whatever crisis happens that it is the deepest that ever was. But that's not the way we should approach it. We just realize that every crisis calls for the right reaction. And that's what we are doing in Europe right now. I'll speak briefly about it at the end of my introduction. And let's just realize that the world advances through stages, and the same is true for Europe. And that's what we're focusing on today as we celebrate two anniversaries, the 50th anniversary of the Werner Report and the 10th anniversary of the EU Rescue Funds, the European Financial Stability Facility, which was set up 10 years ago, which 2 years later became the European Stability Mechanism. Now, as Werner rightly pointed out, Pierre Werner was a long-standing Prime Minister for Luxembourg for over 20 years. He was a kind of father figure for Luxembourgers over many decades, and had this specialty of Luxembourg, which in this government is not the case, but often was the case in Luxembourg, that the Prime Minister is also Finance Minister. And I remember Jean-Claude Juncker once being asked what was the best decision he had ever taken in his life. He answered, to be Prime Minister and Finance Minister at the same time. It's a very efficient way of working. Now, when Werner was asked to do his report, times were different from today. But I think he was a very acute and astute diplomat, Pierre Werner, because having been a finance minister for a long time, he knew the intricacies and the details and the technicalities of finance. Probably that's why they asked him to chair the group. He was also a pioneer in the sense that he realized how important a common currency would be to build an economic and monetary union, and at the same time saying that it was crucial for the future, and also a pioneer in thinking that it was possible to do a monetary union without necessarily having immediately common economic policies. Well, that was quite keen at the time. Now, the report has become famous for many reasons, but one most important, which I'm going to read in the original language, in French. L'Union économique et monétaire apparaît comme un ferment pour le développement de l'union politique dont elle ne pourra à la longue se passer. So, meaning that the economic and monetary union was the ferment for a future political union which would be unescapable. How more visionary can you be? Now, my team was thinking a lot about the word ferment. They weren't sure the French word ferment existed in English. It does. But then maybe we could use another word for this common currency or monetary union. We could call it the yeast, but that's maybe too close to baking. So today we would say to boost, or the boost for a political union, and even more 21st century, we would call it an accelerator. You see how the vocabulary changes over decades. Now, 1970, when the report was done, Werner and the team around him of experts were in a world of fixed exchange rates. They were in a world where free flow of capital was far more rare than today. Now, I'm just going to give a few dates that will show you how difficult it was to predict the future. 1971, Bretton Woods. Off we go, different world, flexible exchange rates were coming. 1989, fall of Berlin Wall, Delors report saying we need a monetary union. 1993, Maastricht Treaty, we do the monetary union. 1998, first Eurogroup meeting in Luxembourg. 1999 and 2002, introduction of the common currency. 2005, first president that is permanent at the head of the Eurogroup, Jean-Claude Juncker, who can be considered the political child of Pierre Werner as he took him into government of Luxembourg back in 1982. And then, obviously, we come to 2008, financial crisis, which Europe has weathered. And it's on that occasion, and that obviously makes the link with the EFSF and the ESM. 2008, we have the financial crisis, and one of the best answers that was given at the time was the setting up of these rescue funds. And 295 billion euro were mobilized for 5 countries in those years to help those countries and basically give credibility to the euro. Now, who became the head of the EFSF and then of the ESM is Klaus Regling. He is here with us in Luxembourg. The ESM has its headquarters here, as has the European Investment Bank and many other European institutions, which we love to have here in Kirchberg in Luxembourg. Now, let me say a few words on Klaus Regling. I think he epitomizes what living European history means, in the sense that he was a high civil servant in Germany in the 80s when the Stability and Growth Pact was written, and he helped draft it. He later became a Director General in the Commission and obviously helped make the euro live, and then was appointed the head of the EFSF and later ESM. Now, some of you might know it, but the people who listen to us probably don't. The way he was hired, Jean-Claude Juncker told it to me personally, because Jean-Claude Juncker really wanted him, and he had asked his staff, well, can we ask Klaus Regling if he would like to head this institution? And his staff answered, well, he's not available, he's far away, he's in the Far East, and he's not interested. And he got that news during a Eurogroup, and he said, that cannot be. give me Klaus Regling on the phone. And he called him during a Eurogroup meeting and said to him, Klaus, we need you. And obviously then Klaus could not resist and could not say no. So we're glad to have you here in Luxembourg, Klaus, not only because you accepted, but because also you've spent so many years here, and you recently celebrated a round anniversary, the number of which I'm not going to reveal to the large public that is listening to us. But I could really say that the ESM is your third child after your son and your daughter. Now, the ESM is progressing. Recently, we decided all together that its role should be boosted, accelerated, if you want, in a kind of preventive role, and especially to be the backstop for the Single Resolution Fund. So that brings me to today's world, and I'm not going to talk a lot about what Europe did in the context of the COVID crisis, because it is spectacular, and I'm sure that the 5 panelists are going to dwell on it, so I'm not going to speak a lot about it, just to say that we had an emergency response with the 3-pronged emergency reactions, 540 billion, and then we have the multi-annual budget, and then we have the recovery fund. So all of that is spectacular, and I must say, as a Luxembourg finance minister, I'm very glad that we did so. Luxembourg was one of the 9 countries that, as soon as March, called for a European reaction and European solidarity, and we have delivered, giving Europe for the first time a capability to lend as a community. What an achievement. I think Pierre Werner, if he sees us, would have been very pleased to see this development. I will conclude on a personal note, because obviously as a Luxembourger, I knew Pierre Werner. I knew him reasonably well. First of all, he became a finance minister the year I was born. Then he was the prime minister when I was hired as a diplomat back in 1983. And then he stayed around for many years, and I had one conversation with him, which would be my conclusion, which is the following. I remember I was posted in Paris at the embassy, and I met Pierre Werner, and he said, Mr. Gramegna, how are you doing? Well, I said, I'm very worried about many things about Europe. And I told him all the things I was worried about. And then he looked at me and said, he said, Mr. Gramegna, you know, these European questions, they're always very difficult. But you know, in politics, the worst is never certain. The worst is never certain. That was the motto of Pierre Werner. I tell you, this has stayed with me all my life. It helps me a lot now, since I've become a finance minister myself for 7 years, being one of the successors of Pierre Werner. And I would like to add to his sentence, the worst is never certain, and there's always hope if you persevere. So on that note, I give it back to you, Werner, and I wish us a good conference.
Thank you very much, Pierre. It's a pleasure to listen to you and get some education on the long history of European integration and the key role that Pierre Werner played at that time. And roughly halfway between the Werner Plan and today, we had Maastricht, the Treaty on European Economic Community in the European Union, later in Maastricht. That treaty created a unique historical asymmetry. On the one hand, a European supranational monetary order, yet predominantly still national sovereignty in many other areas. These are not my words, though I suspect we could probably all agree with them, but those of Ottmar Issing, the then ECB chief economist, delivering the first Bridge Forum lecture some 20 years ago here in Luxembourg. Professor Issing said this combination would create a tension that will leave its mark on the future integration process. And indeed, that has proved to be the case. The creation of the first euro area rescue funds 10 years ago, being a direct response to the challenge of managing national budgets in good times as well as bad. The treaty was itself, of course, the culmination of a process set in motion 50 years ago this week, as a matter of fact, on the 8th of October, so we are a little bit ahead of time. by the Werner Report, or more officially, the report to the Council and the Commission on the realization by stages of economic and monetary union in the community. Pierre Werner, who lived long enough to see his vision come true, was clear why monetary union was needed. It was to stop the risk of a recurrence of the competitive devaluations of the 30s and the possible consequence, another war in Europe. So this was a very, very political project. And the report stressed that for monetary union to be successful, there was a need for deeper political as well as economic integration, including harmonization of tax policies, what we would call today a capital markets union, and crucially, some central oversight of national budgets under the scrutiny of the European Parliament. Indeed, the creation of a European system of central banks to manage a possible common currency would only come once these elements were in place. The Maastricht Treaty, of course, did not follow this blueprint, creating the euro within a loose framework of economic cooperation, and its chapters on EMU were left largely unchanged by the later Amsterdam and Lisbon treaties. Now, 10 years after the financial crisis, this framework is once again being tested by the economic effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So, to understand where we are and where we might be heading, I would now hand the floor to our distinguished panelists, none of whom needs long introduction. Christine Lagarde, the President of the European Central Bank, former IMF Managing Director and French Minister of Finance during the financial crisis. Valdis Dombrovskis, Executive Vice President of the European Commission, responsible for economic affairs and now soon for trade as well. So good luck with that additional burden on your shoulders, Valdis. Paschal Donohoe, recently elected President of the Eurogroup and Finance Minister of the Republic of Ireland. And finally, last but not least, Klaus Regling, who was introduced in detail by Pierre Gramegna. And by the way, since 25 years, we in different ways and in different positions and on different paths which cross again and again, we cooperate together on European affairs. So having introduced you first, Christine, could I please start by asking you, the principles of the Werner Report paved the way for the single European currency. As president of the ECB, to some extent, you now carry out what was written down back then. In your view, what the idea was the idea of Pierre Werner, a realistic vision of the euro area? What lessons can we draw from it and from the experiences we made since in this process that led from the Werner plan to the situation today? Christine, you have it.
Thank you so much, Werner, and thank you to Klaus Regling for hosting this really interesting seminar and conference. And happy birthday to the European Stability Mechanism, as well as to you, Klaus, on this occasion. I was a teenager when the report was published, so I had to go back to a bit of history and to those who have worked with Mr. Werner at the time to find out exactly what was behind the report in terms of who was that person who came up with such a vision and so much inspiration. And much to my surprise, I was actually informed by somebody who is the same age as you, Klaus, and who worked at a very early stage with Pierre Werner. He told me he was a consumed, perfect combination of the ultimate technocrat and a great visionary. And it really shows in the report and in what he has proposed, because he has in many ways laid out some of the foundations that we still have to this day. He was the one who talked about the three-stage approach. He was the one who talked about the irreversibility of the process. And we all know that for the euro to be irreversible, we didn't have to wait for too many years, but it was certainly repeated recently and made a stronger impression. But he had that irreversibility principle in the early stage. He also paid great attention, him and his advisors, of course, to macroeconomic governance. He was very much a supporter of symmetry between fiscal policy, monetary policy, and the alliance between the two. He was supportive of financial integration, and he made political union his ultimate objective. And frankly, apart from having totally forgotten to mention the European Central Bank, which did not feature in his report, he really anticipated a lot of what we have today. And in some way, we have let him down because it's work in progress relative to where he was. Clearly, markets are not sufficiently integrated and they exacerbate shock more than they absorb shock. If we compare the shock absorption capacity of the euro area, for instance, with that of the United States, but the US is capable of absorbing shock much more so, about 70% of the shock, as opposed to us where we absorb roughly 25%. Second, fiscal policies are still loosely coordinated and tend to be pro-cyclical. And, that was very visible at the time of the great financial crisis, when the euro area produced essentially fiscal tightening in the amount of about 2.5%, while in the meantime, there was fiscal loosening on the other side of the ocean in the US of 0.8%. So in both financial integration, fiscal coordination, and I would say fiscal risk sharing as well, although Pierre, rightly so, emphasized what has just been decided by the European Council when it comes to shared borrowing in exceptional circumstances. But on this fiscal sharing, it's not really exactly available except on this ad hoc basis. Now, there are four areas that I will mention where he actually anticipated what we need to do. First of all, as he required full financial integration, we know that we have to make progress on both banking union and completing capital market union. So that's work to be done that he had anticipated. Second area, he required a center of decision for economic policies. Well, when we have those stronger and independent national fiscal councils and simpler stability and growth pact rules, that would help in that direction. His report required a transitioning to a political union with common institutions. Well, I would agree with Pierre, who just spoke to that issue, that the Recovery and Resilience Fund is one step in that direction of having more in common than we have to separate us. And where he was interestingly quite a visionary as well, is that he actually supported and explicitly mentions in the report the protection of the environment. And we know that the environment protection, as well as digitalization, that I hope we can touch on later on, Werner, are two key axes that are considered by the Commission in order to respond to this aspiration and this vision that he laid out 50 years ago. So he was definitely that visionary, but he also had the skills and the competence of a super-duper technocrat to actually identify what steps should be taken, what principles should be laid out, and how we should go about being together stronger rather than separate and weaker.
Thank you so much, Christine. A lot of things to think about and to come back to. And I would like now to pass on to Paschal Donohoe, the president of the Eurogroup. Paschal, Pierre Werner was a determined advocate of European integration and to the precursor of economic and monetary union. Has that been completed? Where are the gaps? What needs to be done?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much, Klaus. And also, as Pierre has done, may I extend my own best wishes both to Klaus and also to his institution on given the recent birthday of both. I was really struck by the amazingly eloquent introduction that Pierre gave and the lovely way he concluded when he talked about the need to remind all of us at the moment, and all of us in public and in political life, that the worst is never certain. And I think it's a very fitting political insight, given the many, many challenges that we are now facing at the moment, and the heightened atmosphere of uncertainty that so many face now about their health, about their lives and about their livelihood. And one of the greatest antidotes to this fear of the worst is the role of public life and the role of politics in making decisions that allows communities, individuals, and indeed countries to achieve far more together than they ever can on their own. And this is, of course, one of the ongoing foundations, not only of our efforts of monetary integration, but it is one of the living foundations for the political project that is the European Union. And I think this is relevant to the question that you've put to me, Werner, when you ask, is it complete? What remains to be done? And for me, this project is a reflection of the essence of the European project, which is that it is always ongoing. There is always more to do. And the political wonder at the heart of European integration is that it is both a commitment to stability and a commitment to change at the same time. The words of ever closer union always act as background music to the meetings that we have of Eurogroup, to the engagement that we have with each other. And that dynamic for both stability and change coexists with each other because of the desire for stability and support for the citizens of Europe, particularly at the moment, with all that we are dealing with. But the need for change is always there because of the changing world that we're in, where the only certainty is that change will continue. So when we look at the project of monetary integration, of how we strengthen our shared currency, there will always be work that needs to be done. There will always be projects that are unfinished. There will always be new projects that need to be started, because that is the very essence of how we engage with each other politically. And it's also a reflection of the change within which we're anchored in and how we look to make ourselves secure. So I'm sure in the other questions that you'll put to me and in the discussion that we'll have, we'll be able to outline what that change will be, what remains to be done. But I think the summary of my answer to your very important question is that there will always more that we need to do. There will always be more progress that is possible. But as we look at what we want to do, from what Christine has said, from what Pierre has said, we should never lose sight of all that we have achieved. And if I look at what the European project has achieved just in the last number of months, there are things that we are now agreed on that even a few months ago we would have thought impossible. And that does remind us that if the worst is never certain, it also reminds us that agreement and progress is always possible.
Thank you very much, Paschal. I'd like to turn to Valdis Dombrovskis now, the Executive Vice President of the European Commission. Valdis, the European Union has articulated an unprecedented response to the current COVID-19 crisis, from SURE to Next Generation EU, and many concrete plans. They also relate to what Christine touched upon: climate, resilience, and sustainability. So how and where will this enormous response of the European Union make a difference? Valdis, you are muted.
I'm not muted.
Okay, now we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Dear Werner, dear colleagues, good afternoon. Well, indeed, if you look at our crisis response, indeed, European Union managed to respond in a united and coordinated way, and came forward with a set of proposals which indeed is unprecedented. And I would distinguish between, so to say, immediate crisis response instrument and Next Generation EU, which is European Economic Recovery Plan. And on crisis response instruments, I would say they are already making a difference. For example, short-term work schemes in member states have played an important role in cushioning the impact on unemployment during the crisis. And we are supporting those short-term work schemes through our SURE program. Coronavirus Response Investment Initiative, CRII and CRI Plus, provided member states with much needed support from EU budget, so possibility to use still existing structural and investment funds as a crisis response. We look at the action, say, of the EIB group in providing the financing to the companies. Well, ESM, whose pandemic crisis support program is helping to reassure markets that there is a next line of defense if it's needed in some member states. ECB action, including pandemic emergency purchase program. I think it all amounted to the situation that he managed to cushion the impact of the crisis. And we are not having to respond to, so to say, existential questions. Eurozone, for example, on the brink of collapse, as it was asked many times during the global financial and economical crisis. So that's the first important element, that we came together in a joint and a coordinated response. Then looking forward, of course, we also need a common response for European economic recovery, and that's where our next generation plan comes in. And according to our estimates, the next generation EU can deliver up to 2% of additional gross domestic product by 2024, because the program is lasting till 2024, and help create 2 million jobs. And it's strongly anchored in broader European economic policy priorities, green and digital transitions. Just today, finance ministers managed to agree on recovery and resilience facility, which is a bulk of our next generation EU plan, with ambitious mainstreaming targets of 37% for climate-related expenditure and 20% for digital expenditure. So clearly link also with forward-looking European policies. So I would say it all allows us to hope that not only Europe will be able to emerge from the crisis, Europe will be able to emerge from the crisis stronger, and also with a strong forward-looking policies supporting green and digital transformation of European economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valdis. It's really an impressive package that the European Union has put on the table. And I remember vividly these never-ending Eurogroup and ECOFIN meetings during this time of the crisis. And I remember best one Eurogroup meeting where, after discussing between Klaus and Christine and myself, Christine took the floor for all of us, saying with full admiration for all these national packages that have been put on the table, what we need is a European response which is fat, fast, and flexible. And I think these were the criteria we needed, because this is not a crisis of our national budgets. This is a crisis of our businesses, of our households, of our entrepreneurs, and our jobs. And that does not take a response that takes 2 or 3 years or a new legislation. So sorry for this remark in between. Coming back to EMU, Valdis, as the Werner Report puts it, the EMU is built in stages. That was the word, that built in stages, not a one-off or a big bang. How to best bring about the next stages to complete EMU?
Thank you, Werner. Dear colleagues, I would say everything which he had been witnessing in terms of economic and monetary union, indeed, it demonstrates that it has been built on stages. Building first the monetary union as a response to the global financial and economical crisis. There is acknowledgement of a stronger need for coordination of macroeconomic and fiscal policies. There is acknowledging of the need of creating a banking union. We are currently working on a capital market union. And now we are making the next steps in economic and monetary union. I think already what we have proposed in terms of our crisis response actually is making this next step. But of course, there are questions on how to move forward. And there, for example, as regards possible features of the EMU architecture, we currently have our SURE program, which is a temporary program with a legal basis clearly anchored in emergency response. But we are looking how we can actually strengthen this common European response. And for example, for the European Commission side, we are assessing how to move towards a permanent European unemployment reinsurance scheme. And we know that this debate on common European fiscal capacity, even though limited, it's not a new discussion. We have been discussing unemployment reinsurance scheme. We have been discussing European investment stabilization scheme. And what we are now having with SURE, it's something we can test in practice, and helpfully it will also provide us future guidance and future impetus also on setting up more permanent European or Euro area fiscal capacity. Thank you.
Thank you, Valdis. I'd now like to turn to one of the most fascinating institutions of the European integration process, which was set up as a successor to EFSF, the European Financial Stability Fund, and the mastermind behind the two institutions and now the managing director of ESM is Klaus Regling. Klaus, you have gone through all these difficult times, 3 crises, 2 rescue funds. What are the lessons learned?
Thank you, Werner, and good afternoon to all of you. Happy to be here on this panel. And I think this afternoon is also the moment to look back a little bit, mainly to look forward. But let me start with the first 50 years ago when Pierre Werner presented his report. I was studying economics at the university. And 3 years later, in 1973, I wrote my thesis on the theory of optimum currency areas. And it included a chapter with an assessment of the Pierre Werner plan. So the topic has never left me since. But back to your question, Werner, 3 crises, 2 rescue funds, what are the lessons? I think we learn all the time. That's good. But typically, we need a crisis to act. Certainly 10 years ago, the creation of first the EFSF and then the ESM is another example. This would not have happened before the Euro crisis. So we needed the crisis to act. But in the crisis, which was a serious one, European countries came together to fix a serious problem in a convincing way. Together with banking union and its institutions, the ESM is the most recent important institutional change in the architecture of monetary union. And while it is true that we had to manage 3 crises over the last 13, 14 years, it is very clear that these crises were all very different. And the global financial crisis, the Euro crisis, very different from the current one. And because these crises are so different, our policy responses also have to be very different, and they are different. In the past, we needed, and when I say we, I mean particularly the adjustment we had to support from the EFSF and the ESM, we needed to correct big macroeconomic misalignments and past policy mistakes. So we needed what economists call conditionality, which means we had to link financial support to reform commitments. And it worked under those circumstances. It worked well. EFSF and ESM loans with conditionality helped 5 countries to regain market access and to have an above-average economic performance afterwards. But to apply conditionality in the current situation would be wrong. We do not need today to correct past policy mistakes. We respond to a common external shock for which governments are not responsible. Overall, the policy response to COVID-19 is substantially larger than during the global financial crisis. I believe this is appropriate, given that this crisis is the worst economic crisis in living memory. Under these circumstances, the ESM, as well as the other institutions that make up Europe's response to COVID-19, provides a very different kind of support to euro area countries. The ESM's pandemic crisis support helps countries to finance their direct and indirect healthcare costs. Countries can apply for it until the end of 2022. They can receive up to 2% of their GDP. So the money is earmarked for a certain purpose, health sector cost. And that is the only condition. There's no other condition. I think that's clearly a lesson we learned over the decade. It's a different crisis. We needed to create a different instrument. So the lesson learned in a nutshell is when there's a crisis, we have to be fast. We need to be well organized. We need to coordinate well between European institutions and with national governments. And importantly, provide financial support in the right way, depending on the nature of the problem that needs to be fixed. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Klaus. May I dig a little bit deeper into your past? Because you have been working on the EU Stability and Growth Pact during its initial phase. During the pandemic now, the EU Commission suspended the EU fiscal rules of the Stability and Growth Pact for the first time in history. But one day we will need to activate them again, I guess. What needs to be in place to go back to the fiscal rules, and will we apply the pre-pandemic rules in a post-pandemic world?
Yes, it's a good question. And indeed, I was in the German Ministry of Finance and drafted the first draft of the Stability and Growth Pact. I think it has worked better than often it's given credit, including for the escape clause. For example, the escape clause was there in the first draft of the Stability and Growth Pact, and it was very appropriate to activate it now. I also think overall the pact has worked better than many people believe. For instance, in 2008 and again now in 2019, so the years before the 2 major crises, the euro area as a whole had a very, very small deficit, while other large regions of the world had deficits of 3 or 4% of GDP. So Europe entered the crisis with more fiscal space than other parts of the world, and I think that was because of the Stability Pact. So in that sense it worked. It didn't work perfectly well, that is for sure, but it has worked reasonably well. But I think the pact needs to be reformed. It needs to become more credible. It should be simpler and better understandable by markets and by policymakers. I know from my regular contacts with investors that they don't have much faith in the current pact. And there's a second reason why we need to reform the Stability Pact after the 2005 reform and again 2011. Very much is based on variables that are not observable. The structural balance plays a key role, and the structural balance must be estimated, and that requires an estimate of output gap and potential growth rate for every country in the euro area. And there is today no commonly accepted methodology to do that. In the 90s, there was a methodology that was commonly agreed among all euro area member states to use to make those calculations. But with the global financial crisis, the relationships broke down and we don't have a methodology at the moment that works. So those are reasons why we need a reform. But I think when I look at the next few years where we need to think about an exit strategy, I think we have to answer 3 questions. They're all difficult. The first one is, for how long should the general escape clause be suspended? Second, what is the appropriate fiscal path for every member country of the euro area during the next few years? And then third, how could a revised, simpler and credible fiscal surveillance framework look like? It will not be easy to answer these 3 questions, but I think we have to start the process. But 2 things are clear for me. The first is that fiscal policy must be coordinated in a monetary union as we have it today, where monetary policy is fully centralized, while fiscal policy is under the responsibility of national governments. With that situation, coordination is a must. And second, once we are out of the crisis, deficits have to decline again to avoid getting into debt sustainability problems.
Thank you, Klaus. Paschal, back to you. When Christina and Klaus and myself presented to the Eurogroup and the ECOFIN the need to come up with a European response to the COVID crisis, the main reason for this was not that we would not be happy with the national schemes, but we would think that the integrity of the internal market might be at risk if we do not come with a level playing field in this respect. So a similar situation is now there because the coherence in recovery plans across the Eurozone might not everywhere be seen. How important is this coherence?
Thank you very much, Werner. It is hugely important, and the reason for that goes back to the issues there that Klaus touched on in his answer to your last question, when he talked about when you are sharing a currency, how important the coordination of economic policy is. And by achieving that coordination, we hopefully minimize risk that can also be multiplied in a currency union. And by being successful in coordinating our efforts, we can allow each country to achieve more collectively. If we have a common approach to the common challenges that we are facing, it gives a better chance that for the small Irish company that's looking to export goods to Luxembourg, that there will be the adequate level of demand within Luxembourg to allow the purchase of those goods. And similarly, for the exporter of services within Luxembourg, if they're looking to sell those into Ireland, if we're coordinating our efforts, it should allow, hopefully, the right services to be supplied, but as importantly, will allow the demand being there to purchase services from the citizens that Pierre is leading. And it goes back to the political foundation of the European project that we're trying to recognise here, that interdependence can sometimes be a source of risk. And of course, we're learning that at the moment in dealing with this terrible disease. But that when those in public life come together to be brave, to try to make the case for working together, that interdependence can be a source of huge strength. And that, I believe, is being shown at the moment. And I thought Valdis made it very clear, what is the ambition of all of us from this? It's not just to emerge from this safely, it's to emerge in a better way and create something that is better than what we left. And I think this has been very clear in all of the actions that have been taken so far, very clear in how quickly the European Central Bank under Christine's leadership looked to act decisively, very clear then in the work that has been done by the ESM, the work of the European Commission in the different instruments they've made available. And then us as finance ministers have worked very hard to either support our leaders with the RRF or to agree instruments that are now being used to save jobs. So I think we have, in the face of amazing difficulty, we've achieved much, but we all know there is more that we will need to do. I know that we're all very aware of that need at the moment, and we'll work hard to do that.
Thank you very much, Pascal. I would like to come back to Christine, because that links directly to what you have just been saying. What does the economic situation during the ongoing COVID-19 crisis look like in your view, in your assessment, and what will change more structurally because of this crisis?
Thank you, Werner. And to the risk of irritating Pierre, I would simply like to remind ourselves that what we've gone through during the first and the second quarter of this year has been unprecedented. I'm not sure it's the worst ever, because le pire n'est jamais sûr, as Pierre would say, but it has been unprecedented in peacetime. For quarter-on-quarter GDP to go down by minus almost 12% in the second quarter after minus 3.6% in the first quarter, for 5 million jobs to have just gone in the first 6 months of 2020, which really wiped out half of what had been created and developed since 2013. It was just a massive, deep shock. So where we are now, thanks to the action of finance ministers, and their fiscal action was really very, very welcome. You know, to put nearly 4.5% of GDP into fiscal measures, not to mention the guarantees that were put in place, not to mention the special support package that was prepared by the ESM under Klaus' leadership, not to mention the guarantee schemes that you're still working on, Werner, with the at the EIB. In spite of all that, and the monetary policy tools that we put very, very promptly on the table, this recovery is still today uneven, incomplete, and uncertain. And to give you an example of that, based on the research work that we've done here at the ECB, we believe that we will be back to pre-COVID time in terms of GDP level at the, late in 2022. So that says quite a lot about the ground that we need to cover. Second, what we have observed, and I think it's testimony to how concerned people are, is their propensity to save beyond the sort of forced saving that took place during the first couple of months in March and April. The precautionary saving that we are seeing across Europe is also unprecedented. And incomplete and asymmetric is also this recovery, because when you look at the numbers, you see very clearly that the manufacturing sector is recovering, and we are above 50 by quite a way in terms of PMI. But if you look at the PMI services, we are still contracting. So the recovery is taking hold in manufacturing, but it is still lagging in terms of services. So turning to the policy efforts that needs to be considered still today in order to support the recovery and to make it less uncertain, less incomplete, and to accelerate it, I would put, say, three particular items on the agenda. Number one is the issue of timing. Because while a lot has been done in 2020, 4.5% is no small fiscal effort, not a lot has been legislated by some member states in 2021. And we know for a fact that just as the escape clause will continue to be lifted in 2021, fiscal effort will be needed. So that's one example. No premature fiscal tightening is to be expected in 2021. Second, we also know from research that after at least 2 months of restriction, around 30% of European firms are facing severe liquidity problems. And I know that the EIB is publishing on a regular basis some really excellent surveys demonstrating that there are liquidity issues, and it puts a brake on investment projects for firms. And third area is, in terms of policy that will be needed, is how do you develop and retool the human capital, the workers, the employees who are at a risk of either losing their job or have lost their job. And there was a really good study that was done by the World Bank. I should refer to the IMF study, but this one was done by the World Bank, which looked at a series of pandemics in the last decades, the last couple of decades, which went as far back as SARS back in 2002. And it shows that past pandemics were associated with 6% lower labor productivity and 11% lower investment, not in year one, but 5 years down the road after the pandemic has been dealt with. So those are areas that will require policy action. And I would like to finish, Werner, if I may, on one particular area which I think is going to be a structural shift going forward, and which will play in a fairly unequal way. And that is the impact that digitalization is having on us. I mean, you two are together in the same room, but all the other participants are in different locations. We are effectively teleworking, we are teleconferencing, we are teleseminaring. And this is happening in multiple instances, particularly in the service industry, which is the most labor-intensive activity. Well, the work that is being done shows that if 37% of the jobs in the service industry are likely to be teleworked, one comes to realize very quickly that those jobs that will be teleworked are the ones that are at the higher end of the wage range, whereas those at the lower end of the wage range in the service industry are much less likely to be teleworked. So that recovery, which will induce structural changes in the way we work, in the way we spend, in the way we get together, is going to produce distributional effects, which will produce probably more inequality. And that's an area where everybody needs to be attentive.
Thank you very much, Christine. And that brings me right back to Valdis, because the long-term impact of Next Generation EU, incorporating these structural changes that Christine has been talking about, is going to be of extreme importance. Is this going to be a leap forward to building a closer union? Is this also a political driver of the integration process?
Yes, thank you, Werner. Well, on the long-term impact of the Next Generation EU, indeed, it can be also a next stage, a next step in deepening economic and monetary union. Well, first, of course, I would say we now need to conclude the legislative work on the Next Generation EU, because it's not concluded yet. And we need to deliver and implement this Next Generation EU. We are waiting for recovery and resilience plans from member states. Well, we expect them informally starting submitting them as of middle of the month. So the first, in any case, will be still in the implementation before we can really start discussing the longer-term impacts. But where we really want this recovery and resilience facility to make a longer-term impact is on the green and digital transitions of the economy. Many of you talked about structural shifts of the economy. So with the help of European Economic Recovery Plan, our intention is not to go back to the pre-crisis status quo in terms of economy, but rather indeed use this money to drive to accelerate green and digital transitions of our economies. So from that point of view, yes, it will definitely bring a structural shift on how our economies is working. Maybe let me come to some of the points which were raised by colleagues on the fiscal position. I think we all agree that there should not be a premature fiscal tightening. Actually, together with Commissioner Gentiloni, I have already written a letter to Member States' finance ministers outlining that the general escape clause will remain active in 2021, so Member States can prepare their 2021 budgets without quantitative restrictions being set on their budget deficits. Of course, Member States need to keep in mind medium-term fiscal sustainability. and we would come back to the reassessment of this situation in spring 2021, but that's in any case already with a view of 2022 and seeing how the situation is really developing. And indeed, what is critical access right now, critical issue right now is access to finance for European companies, especially European SMEs, because many of them are facing a critical situation. In summer, we managed to agree what we call best practices with banks, with other financial sector participants, with business organizations, with consumer organizations on how banks can support the companies during this period of the crisis. We now continue, this is a broader topic on access of finance for European economy. And this will remain very important, and we will need to work very seriously with the financial sector. Of course, we hope also with the support from European investment banks through its pan-European guarantee fund and member states initiatives. But it's very clear that in order to cushion current economic impact, we need to preserve as much as possible productive capacity of European economy. So to preserve as much as possible European companies and jobs, and the better we are at this, the faster can be the economic recovery once a pandemic is over.
Thank you very much, Valdis. I'll come back to your points in a minute, but before I do that, I want to know from Klaus whether the rescue funds are well prepared for future crises, and if not, what needs to be done?
Yes, so for this crisis, we have created the pandemic crisis support. Looking forward, I first want to look at the gaps that exist in the monetary union today. So what do we need to do to make monetary union more resilient and less vulnerable? And then I can see where the ESM might fit in, but of course many others have to contribute to that as well. And the main gaps, I think, are clearly identified. Some of you have talked about it. There's the banking union, the capital markets union. If we make good progress there, that would increase private risk sharing, as Christine said. There would be better shock absorption in the euro area, therefore also less need for fiscal support or for the rescue funds. It would also, if we make progress on banking union and capital markets union, raise the growth potential of euro area countries. So this is really key, and I'm very glad that Valdis has this on the top of his agenda. The other items are more controversial. I think we do need a fiscal capacity for macroeconomic stabilization in the euro area. That would provide more risk sharing. And I think we should look at all the different ideas to make the euro stronger in the international monetary system, which also requires a larger volume of safe euro assets. So what can the ESM do in some of these areas? We are prepared to provide the backstop to the Single Resolution Fund. That's one of the remaining gaps in the banking union, and hopefully this can be agreed. This requires a change of the ESM treaty, and Paschal is working hard to reach that agreement in the Eurogroup before the end of the year. Then we need the ratification and can provide the backstop, one element, but only one, for completing the banking union. On the fiscal capacity, there are many ideas on the table. Valdis talked about some of them. The ESM could also provide such a facility, because what we need is a revolving fund that's always available from one crisis to the next. We don't really need an annual budget, and this is exactly what the ESM could deliver, a revolving fund, so loans that have to be repaid within a cycle, so that the money is again available for the next crisis, and that would add more fiscal buffers to the national fiscal buffers, which of course are the first line of defense for member states, but one can expand those and the ESM has enough firepower to do that. On the question of safe assets, I think bonds issued by the Commission, by the EIB, by the ESM, they all represent safe assets, together with the bonds issued by the top-rated sovereigns in the euro area. And here we are making good progress with the crisis, because the three institutions that have issued bonds in the past, Commission, EIB and ESM, have so far issued around 800 billion euro. With the different crisis measures that we are discussing this afternoon that were adopted the last few months, this could go up to 2 trillion. So that's a big jump in safe assets. And of course, member states with larger deficits are now adding also to these safe assets. So overall, we are making here significant progress, moving the volume of safe assets from around 20% of euro area GDP in the past to something like 40% in 2-3 years. But still, compared to the US, they have around 90%. That's of US GDP. That's the volume of US Treasury bonds and bills. So there we are quite a bit away, but we are making progress, and I think that's also something that would make the euro area more resilient and strengthen the international role of the euro.
Thank you very much, Klaus. I would like to return to Christine, because one thing that was definitely not mentioned in the Werner Report are climate change and digitalization. Well, of course, you touched upon digitalization already, indirectly also on digital currencies, but on climate. Climate has changed my institution, the European Investment Bank, totally. On the way to being the EU Climate Bank, we had to refocus totally and had to get rid of old legacies. Now, this is a huge transformation process that must take place in order to reach the ambitions that I presented to the United Nations last year in the General Assembly. But how does ECB go around with this? How much will climate and digitalization, but in particular climate, change the ECB?
Well, thank you, Werner. First of all, I think Pierre Werner, I did not mention climate change. I think climate change was an expression that did not really exist at the time, but he talks about the protection of the environment. And I don't know whether he had biodiversity and climate change in mind, but it was already there, which shows that really he was a man of vision. So climate change clearly has become front and center of our European citizens' preoccupations. It shows in how they rank their priorities, in how they regard that, I'm just reading from a report that I received, 75% of people in 16 major countries in the European Union expect their government to make environmental protection a priority when planning the post-COVID recovery. So that was an Ipsos survey that was conducted in those 16 countries. It's a very high number of people who regard this as critical because they see the pandemic as one of the first global manifestation of climate change consequences. And there's plenty of study that is now that are now being published in that respect. And my personal conviction is that each and every institution, wherever it is, must ask itself, what can I do about it? And this is one of the topics that we will be addressing in our strategy review that we have now resumed after the COVID break that we had to take. How does climate change affect monetary policy? And, how does it affect variables that are relevant for policy? How does it affect output? How does it impact inflation? How does it impact consumption? So, and how does it affect policy space? Is there a potential for lower natural rate as a result of climate change? How does it affect transmission channels? How do we manage risks related to climate change? And how do banks, which are the transmission channels that we use for monetary policy purposes, how do they factor in the risk assessment of climate change in relation to their activity and their counterparts as well? So there will be plenty of stones to turn in order to determine how we take climate change into account. And there will be schools of thoughts. I'm perfectly aware of that. Some considering that this is purely a matter for governments, for fiscal authorities, for the legislator, and that a central bank should not interfere with that. Well, I think very seriously that we have to consider all this. And we have actually started the process. Just to give you an example, in the area of stress testing, we are working on a framework which includes climate risk stress testing that will be published in the first half of 2021. Equally, the SSM, which is the supervisory arm of the ECB, has now conducted 2 different surveys of banks in 2019 to determine whether or not they take climate change risks into account. And really examining the disclosure standards that are necessary to incorporate climate issues into the risk assessment of our collateral framework is something that we have to look into as well. That could lead to significant changes. Now, clearly another area is how do we manage our investments? Whether they are the ECB's own investment, where we take into account climate change already, or whether we transpose those same principles into larger investment programs that we do as part of our asset management programs. These are areas where we have not yet settled, but where I hope that we can make progress. I'll give you one example, which we have decided now about a week ago, which matters. And it was approved by the Governing Council of the Eurosystem. So we now, from January the 1st onward, we accept bonds with coupon linked to certain sustainable performance targets as collateral, as for credit operations, and outright purchases for monetary policy purposes. Now that is different from what we ever did before, because we never accepted that they could be variable coupons. This is a change that is directly related to climate change and to sustainable performance criteria. This is only the beginning, and there will be more changes in the way, at least changes that will be debated, considered, and given full weight in the strategy review that we are now conducting. I'd be very happy to talk about digitalization because it does have an impact on our payment system, and it does have an impact on our monetary policy as well. But you wanted me to concentrate on climate change.
Thank you. I think we could continue forever and ever because it's really fascinating. And just one small remark in between. You mentioned the farsightedness of Pierre Werner when he made a statement on the necessity to protect our environment. Well, even the creators of the Treaty of Rome were very farsighted because when they established that treaty, and the EIB is, of course, an institution emanating from the Treaty of Rome, they prohibited the bank to finance state budgets and projects which are not sustainable and economically viable. So the word for sustainability was for me something relatively new over the last 2 decades, but it has been the branded thinking of the creators of the Treaty of Rome. Quite interesting. Anyway, I must conclude by giving the floor to Paschal, because you have been elected president of the Eurogroup and chairperson of the Euro Rescue Fund in the height of the pandemic. What are your main goals for these 2 roles in the last 2.5 years of your mandate? Not the last, hopefully not the last, the next.
I'm only just beginning. We have to show, and I believe we are showing, how indispensable a shared currency is to helping our citizens overcome the economic consequences of this disease. And we have to be able to demonstrate that the recovery that will happen will be a more inclusive and will be a more resilient recovery because as Europe we are working on it together, and then as a group of countries within the European Union we are working on a shared recovery through sharing a currency. And this is something that is very prominent in the work programme that has been agreed by my colleagues within the Eurogroup. I consulted with all of them to develop a document that was shared, that all are willing to support. And this concept of the euro working for you working for citizens at a time with such economic strain, I think will be the defining theme of the work that the euro area will need to deliver across the next 2.5 years. We also identify within the work programme what are the steps that we need to take to deepen the resilience of our shared currency and to ensure that the architecture of this currency can also contribute to the recovery that we need to deliver. So topics that have already been touched on by all of my colleagues and friends, concepts like banking union, like capital markets union, the context for them has now changed because of COVID-19, because of what is happening in the lives of the people of Europe. And then the final theme that we touch on is the future of the euro in hoping to see more countries use the currency, use the euro as their shared currency, and also addressing many of the important themes that have been touched on by all speakers in terms of our digital future and the role of currencies in a changing and digital world. So there's some of the main themes, but it is by working with my colleagues within the euro area that collectively we will make progress. And it's a great privilege and honour to have the opportunity to work with them. And while I know the difficulties will be familiar and the challenges will be there in making progress, we're all aware of the responsibility on us at the moment, and we're doing our best to make progress that can make a difference.
Thank you very much, Paschal, and good luck in your new responsibility. And now I must cut it, and thank you very much for these insightful remarks. Very valuable and worthwhile pursuing. But I will now pass the floor to Matteo Maggiore, Head of Communication at EIB, in order to take questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, and thanks everybody for a very lively interest in the debate. Unfortunately, that means that we have many more questions that we can probably deal with in the time available. So I've tried to group them under 3 headings. The first is a question about taxation and the role of taxation. Would the spirit of the Werner Report require more attention, more focused attention on tax harmonization and the way to decide on these matters? A question that was addressed to President Donohoe and Vice President Dombrovskis.
So please, Paschal.
Well, when dealing with questions like this, we should also acknowledge the kind of progress that has been made on areas of taxation within the European Union since the vision of the Werner Report and all the work that has happened. If we look at the development of own resources, the source of own resources and the scale of them is far greater than many of the architects of EMU could have anticipated. And then if I look at the procedures and work that is now in place in the European Union to look at how we can have taxation choices that are more consistent with the spirit of the single market. Again, progress has been achieved there that would have looked so unlikely decades ago when this report was being launched. To use a very practical example, if you look at the way decisions are made in relation to indirect taxation within the European Union, it shows a degree of coordination that, again, is a tribute to finance ministers that are looking to pool our national sovereignties to achieve something that is more powerful. In terms of what is yet to come, firstly, to acknowledge matters of taxation are matters that sit with the ECOFIN group. There are decisions that are made there, while discussions on those issues happen within Eurogroup. Taxation matters are decided within the ECOFIN stream of ministers. And I've no doubt at all that across the coming months and years to come, we will be having further decisions and discussions regarding how we can use decisions about taxation to deepen the foundations of EMU. It should be acknowledged that, of course, there's always the very constructive relationship there between looking at how we can pool decision making within these areas, while also acknowledging that for many, taxation decisions continue to be an important facet of national economic sovereignty. So if you look at how much has changed since this report was launched, we can see how decisions in this area have been wise contributions to deepening the foundations of monetary and currency union. And I've little doubt at all that this is a journey that will continue across the next 50 years.
Thank you very much. Valdis, please.
Yes, thank you, Werner. Thank you for this question. I agree with what Paschal has said. Maybe let me address this question also from the different angle. We were talking about Europe's green and digital transformation. So how we are going to do the transformation of our economy. And also in this area, taxation will play important role. To give a few examples, for example, we look at Energy Taxation Directive, which has not been updated from 2003, and clearly it's out of date if we look at the ambitions and goals we have in European Green Deal. So we need to bring our energy taxation closer with the goals of European Green Deal. So we'll be coming forward with proposal in this area. Digital taxation. Economy is becoming more digital. It's becoming increasingly the issue for member states' tax revenues because digital companies tend to pay effective tax rate, which is only 1/3 of that of classical companies. So something which we need to address. As you know, we are working within the OECD framework internationally and hope for international agreement. But we have been also clear from the Commission side that in absence of international agreement, if we see no progress, we would come forward with European proposal in this area because the issue is in any case there and it needs to be addressed. And the same goes for EU own resources system, that some of the candidates which we have put forward from European Commission side as possible European own resources to reduce reliance on member states' contributions like GNI contributions and to provide European budget with more stable revenue base, once again are closely linked with green and digital transition. To mention carbon border adjustment mechanism, also possible additional revenues coming from emission trading schemes, the same digital taxation. One new own resource on which we have already agreement is, or are very close to agreement, is on a tax on unrecycled plastic or plastic waste, once again in line with our environmental objectives. So this is something which we also need to keep in mind, that when we are doing the green and digital transformation of the economy, taxation should accompany this transition.
Thank you very much. Please,
If there's time for one more question. There is a question principally for President Lagarde about cryptocurrencies, something that was clearly not mentioned in the Werner Report. What kind of impact and role do they have in completing the economic and monetary union?
Well, first of all, terminology matters, and I would differentiate between the crypto assets, which are one category of assets which I'm not going to touch on, and digital currencies, including in particular central bank digital currencies. And that's really one area where the digitalization that we have seen, the preference that people have had in the last few months for e-commerce, for e-payment, for use of intangibles rather than tangible means of payments is going to push us in the direction of exploring the feasibility, the desirability of the digital euro. We have published just recently on Friday a significant report concerning the digital euro, We are calling a public consultation on that. And clearly it needs to respond to the needs of the people, and it needs to be associated with safety, with proper transmission of monetary policy, and with the appropriate autonomy of the European institutions. There is a lot of discussions going on about the strength of Europe, the autonomy of European institutions. Well, clearly, a deep capital markets union is one thing. Having a sovereign, a digital euro is also one of the attributes that we should work on, and we are certainly doing our part.
Very good. One final question directed at Managing Director Regling. Has there been informal interest in the ESM pandemic credit line, and what is the state of progress on that?
Yes, informal interest, of course, because it's available for the 19 members of the euro area, and the finance ministers were all in the meetings where this was decided, so they're all very familiar with it. There's no formal request so far, but I think that's fine, because it's an instrument that was created based on our precautionary credit line, and precautionary means something is available on relatively short notice, because the conditions under which it can be drawn have been decided. And in that sense, markets know about this, and it has had a positive impact on market sentiment, because market knows that our member states can draw 2% of their respective GDP on short notice for zero interest rate, or depending on the circumstances, even negative interest rate. And it's available till the end of 2022. So the positive impact is there. I think there will be formal requests coming, but at the moment all our member states have very good market access. So this is available in case of need.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pity that we have to conclude here now, but I wouldn't want to do that without giving the floor to one of our co-organizers and practically host, the Rector of the University of Luxembourg, Professor Stéphane Pallage.
Madame Lagarde, Mesdames, Messieurs, my name is indeed Stéphane Pallage. I'm the Rector of the University of Luxembourg. On behalf of the President of the Bridge Forum Dialogue, Gaston Reinech, I would like to thank you very much for this very insightful debate. The Werner Report is certainly 50 years old, but it hasn't aged. Neither have the challenges that come with its conclusions. A monetary union is a visionary idea. Belgium and Luxembourg had shared the same currency long before the birth of the Eurozone. And it worked for Belgium and Luxembourg, two countries with very similar industrial net at the time. Pierre Werner saw that monetary union could work for two. It could, of course, work for many. Yet, independent states may have very different economies. They face shocks that are often not symmetric. They may wish to react to these shocks with either of two instruments. Monetary policy is one, budgetary policy is the other. Having a common currency, however, deprives a state from one important policy instrument. The first 10 years of the euro have shown the danger of depriving a state from this instrument. But the euro countries have found a superb way of tackling this problem. And the solution is called the European Stability Mechanism. And it is going to be 8 years old tomorrow, I believe?
In 2 days.
In 2 days. As a macroeconomist, I have worked on the social cost of economic fluctuations. Nobel laureate Robert Lucas had shown that removing aggregate shocks in the United States would have only minor effects on the well-being of American residents. The social cost of business cycles, according to Bob Lucas, was completely outweighed by a small amount of growth. According to this result, we should not care about stabilization instruments and rather focus on growth. On this, Lucas was wrong. Aggregate shocks for the United States say little about actual shocks experienced by member states. In the Eurozone, aggregate shocks fail to capture what Greece or Germany may experience. The social cost of business cycles at the level of a member state is substantially higher and calls for a stabilization mechanism. The Eurozone has understood and implemented what other monetary unions have not. Tomorrow we celebrate Pierre Werner and his vision that makes it possible for someone in Luxembourg to travel to 19 different countries without ever changing currency, making lives of millions of citizens, entrepreneurs, businessmen so much simpler. We celebrate also the ESM's 8th anniversary on the 8th, without which the Eurozone would probably still be facing severe difficulties. The University of Luxembourg will host several commemorative events, starting tomorrow with the conference organized by our Center for Contemporary and Digital History, C2DH, on the Werner Report 50 Years On. Special thanks to Elena Danescu for setting up the amazing program of this conference. In parallel, another conference will also take place this week at the university, co-organized with the ESM and chaired by Professor Ramon Mariman, whom I salute. This conference will focus on a dynamic economic and monetary union. Thank you to the Bridge Forum Dialogue for today's superb discussion. Thank you, Minister Gramegna. Thank you to our speakers, to our partners, to the audience. Do stay with us for this week's program, and thank you and au revoir.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be here. Let me conclude this excellent Bridge Forum again with the wise words of Professor Issing. He said, as long as Europeans do not forget where they have come from, they should also know where they stand today and where they are going in the future. I thank our distinguished panel and audience and Professor Pallage. I hope to see you again next year, hopefully in persona, here in Luxembourg, celebrating the 51st anniversary of the Werner Plan. Thank you very much.